Today is the 5th day since Russia launched its offensive against Ukraine. Before we begin with the details, let's quickly get you the top developments at this hour. Blasts were heard in Ukrainian capital of Kyiv and in the major city of Kharkiv for the 5th consecutive dawn. In a separate statement, Ukrainian officials said a residential building in the city of Chernihiv in northern Ukraine was on fire after being struck by a missile. Another northern Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr was hit by missiles overnight, Ukrainian Ground Forces Command said on Facebook. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky cautioned that the next 24 hours will be crucial for the country. While speaking to the United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Zelensky admitted that Sunday was a difficult time for Ukraine's forces as Russian troops continue shelling in almost all directions. Russia and Ukraine will be holding talks today at the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This after Ukrainian president held talks with Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko, although Zelensky said that he did not believe in the outcome of the meeting.
Скажу відверто, як завжди, я не дуже вірю в результат цієї зустрічі, але нехай спробують. Щоб потім у жодного громадянина України не було жодного сумніву, що я, як президент, не намагався зупинити війну, коли був нехай і маленький, але все ж таки шанс.
Belarus in a referendum decided to go nuclear and drop its non-nuclear status. The new constitution could see nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil for the first time since the country gave them up after the fall of the Soviet Union. The West has said it will not recognize the results of the referendum. Lukashenko said he could ask Russia to return nuclear weapons to Belarus, and the decision has sparked anti-war protests in several cities. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered military to put up deterrence forces on high alert, including nuclear arms. The announcement, however, does not mean Russia intends to use the weapons. U.S. President Joe Biden will be holding a secure call with allies today. The call will take place today evening to discuss developments in Russia's attack on Ukraine and coordinate their united response, the White House has said. Russian forces have destroyed Ukrainian-made world's largest cargo plane, Mriya, a 225 Mriya, meaning the Dream was capable of carrying 640 tons of cargo and was manufactured by Ukrainian aeronautics company Antonov. Ukraine authorities promised in a tweet to rebuild the plane, adding that the dream of a strong and free Ukraine will never perish. Spencer Critchley, a communication consultant and author of Patriots of Two Nations, is now joining us live from California to talk more about the current status of Ukraine. Spencer, welcome to WION.
Good to be here.
Now, Ukraine is facing a humanitarian crisis. Death toll is rising by the day. Refugee influx is also becoming a problem. Spencer, how will the country mend itself after all this is over?
I think really what we're seeing is the independent life of the spirit of some nations, independent to their physical territory or their physical infrastructure, such as the Antonov aircraft that was just destroyed, such as the apartment buildings that have been hit and the military facilities that have been hit. Ukraine is one of those nations that is deeply rooted in its own history and that has a national spirit. And I think that's ultimately why you see the fierce resistance on the part of the Ukrainian people. Putin wants to spin this fictional history of Ukraine as simply a province of a greater Russia. But if you go back through the 1,000 years, the most recent 1,000 years of both countries, you can see that there's a 1,000-year history of Ukraine in parallel with the 1,000-year history of Russia since that time. And the experience of Ukraine at the hands of Russia, especially in the form of the Soviet Union, has been absolutely brutal and tragic. So I think the way they'll recover is by maintaining their connection with that national spirit and continuing to fight, no matter what happens to the physical territory or physical infrastructure.
Right. Are there hopes in the talks scheduled for today between Russia and Ukraine?
I wouldn't think so, because you're not dealing with a good faith actor in the form of the government of Russia. And let me emphasize, the government of Russia is very different from the people of Russia. And the government of Russia can really be seen as an occupying force within Russia, just as it wants to be an occupying force within Ukraine. There is no political legitimacy of the current Russian regime. It's essentially a cabal of gangsters who've been looting the Russian people and making themselves fabulously wealthy. So I don't think we can expect gangsters to be good faith negotiators, and we certainly have never seen Vladimir Putin to be a good faith negotiator. He's playing an entirely different game, which is essentially a game of conquest, ultimately for his own selfish interest.
Spencer, what's the role of Belarus or Alexander Lukashenko in this conflict? On one end, he wants to look like a mediator in the crisis, while on the other, he offers his country's territory to Russia. And now he has set constitutional amendments to go nuclear and drop Belarus's non-nuclear status. What are the gains or losses for Belarus?
Well, I don't have access to the kind of intelligence I might need to speculate on what is in his mind, but I will say that looking at it from the outside, there's a very accurate old saying that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And you'll notice that people who are behaving morally don't have to come up with excuses and explanations for their behavior because it speaks for itself. But when people are behaving immorally, as the Belarusian president is behaving and as Putin is behaving, then they have to spin all of these lies to justify their behavior. And the moment somebody has to lie to justify their behavior, it's a reliable indicator that their behavior is immoral. And that's exactly what we're seeing with Lukashenko as with Putin.
The West believes sanctions will weaken Putin and they are the only option left to salvage the situation in Ukraine. Spencer, what do you make of that statement?
Well, again, there are people who have deeper expertise in defense and international relations than I do, but speaking as someone with some experience in politics and especially on the communications side and trying to win the battle of ideas, trying to win the battle of messaging and the battle of mobilizing people behind you, I think that sanctions are one of the few options that we have because we cannot invade Ukraine since they're not a NATO member, except as a last resort. But that said, I've been impressed with the combination of intelligence and force behind these sanctions. I think they are going to take a real toll. And from the communications point of view, equally important is the impression of force, the impression of resolve, because much of this, as terribly real as the results on the ground are, from the point of view of the leaders involved, and to an extent public opinion, it's a theatrical performance, unfortunately. And so the demonstration of resolve by the United States and the Western Alliance is at least as important as the reality of that resolve.
Finally, Spencer, so where does Ukraine go from here? What happens next?
It's so hard to tell because, you know, Putin, I would have to conclude, like every bully, is ultimately a coward. And like every illegitimate leader, is standing on a hill of sand. So the moment that public support disappears from beneath him, his leadership collapses, unlike somebody who actually has a base of political legitimacy, like you find in a legitimate democracy where the people vote to put somebody in office, granting them legitimacy. Even a popular monarch at least has that form of legitimacy. But an outright dictator who has simply occupied his country for the purposes of looting it has no political legitimacy and no genuine support. So this could go on for a very long time, or it could collapse suddenly. And I think I feel a little more hopeful about the possibility of a sudden collapse, looking at the uprising that's happening within Russia itself.
Live from California, Spencer Critchley, thank you very much for your time and for talking to WION today.
My pleasure.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.